morning, everyone. It's just a couple minutes past 6. We were going to give an extra minute or two. We're really appreciative to everyone for coming out tonight. It is really cold out, so those of you who've come out, we know you actually intend to be here. So thank you on behalf of the Newport Housing Committee. So we're here as an offshoot of the Newport Downtown Development Group. They've hosted this event and put together this talk presented by Kevin Chu, who works with the Vermont Futures Project. Over the course of the last year, the NDD Housing Committee has been looking at various ways to get our community more development, affordable housing, and grow our community while keeping it affordable. It's been a huge task and difficult in every way, in every sense of the word. Pretty much everybody knows about the difficulties that are going on across the state, across the country. Things are very unpredictable right now. Nevertheless, we're hoping that with this presentation, we're offering a sense of hope, a sense of direction, and a sense of something that we can build together here in Newport, in the Northeast Kingdom, and in Vermont in general. A couple housekeeping items. We're going to hold some questions to the end. There will be time for a Q&A. We've also put together a survey, which we're hoping that we can complete at the end of this session. It should be a short survey. There will be some paper and those which
have been given out, or there's the QR code.
Yeah, and there's a QR code. You can do it on your phone. It might be even easier on the phone if you can complete that. Hopefully towards the end of the talk, once you've heard some of what Kevin's had to say. So I won't take too much of your time here, so we'll bring up Kevin. I'm going to let Kevin give a little bit of his bio. He can do a better job. Yes, thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Oh yeah, all right, we got to get the energy going. Good evening, everyone. Yeah. My name is Kevin Chu. I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont Futures Project. I'll say a little bit more about the Futures Project, but since I'm meeting many of you for the first time, I'll share a bit about who I am and what I bring to the work, the perspective that I try to carry into how I look at data and how I think about Vermont's future. So I am the son of immigrant parents. My parents moved to Vermont, of all places, back in 1986. They immigrated from Southeast China, and you might be wondering, how the heck did they choose Vermont? I have an aunt that married an American. They happened to have a home in Shelburne at the time, so that was the one social connection that my parents had to this entire country. That's how they ended up here. So they moved they were in their mid-20s at the time and made a very brave decision to leave behind everything and everyone that they knew to pursue their American dream in search of economic opportunity. And I'm so thankful to say that they were able to find it here in Vermont. They were able to build a life, to realize their American dream. They were able to buy a home, put 3 kids through college. They built their Vermont dream. And I'm just so thankful for the opportunities that they had, that I had growing up. And through my work, I tried to pay that forward to make sure that Vermont continues to be a place of opportunity, not only today, but moving forward into our future as well. So that's the why behind the work for me. I'll say a little bit more about the what of the work. So the Vermont Futures Project, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that tries to answer this mission question on the screen, which is, how can we use data to support the evolution of Vermont's economy towards a thriving future full of opportunity for all? There's that opportunity word again. You might also be looking at this and thinking, a mission question? That's weird. I've seen mission statements, but why a question? Well, here's why. Statements are static. I could say something today in 2026. It might not be relevant in 3, 5, definitely not in 10 years. But we wanted to answer this question and come back to it and answer it in new ways, because as the world continues to evolve, the answers may change, and that's okay. If we embed our values in the question itself, then we'll generate good answers. So what's a possible answer to this? Well, we launched our economic action plan, which was released in January of 2025, so a little over a year ago. And that represented over 2 years of work, not only crunching the numbers and assessing data, but also through community engagement. I had the privilege of traveling all over Vermont to all 14 counties, and I spoke with over 5,000 people to build this economic action plan. It says towards affordability and abundance, and we'll talk about what that means. But I do want to go on record and say we published this before the book Abundance by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson was released, so it's really good to see that they're following our lead here in Vermont, and we're the trendsetters. So let's dive into this. This next slide, if the slides advance. Amir, can you help me out? Thank you. This next slide is word cloud. This is just a sampling of some of the key words and phrases through that public engagement. These were the things that I heard from Vermonters. I wanted to understand what are the barriers they're facing, what are the challenges to economic opportunity, but more importantly, what are their hopes, dreams, and ambitions for the future, for themselves, for their kids, for their grandkids. And as we take a look at these words, we can start to separate it into symptoms and root causes. The symptoms are things that we hear all the time: workforce shortages, the housing crisis, healthcare, affordability, education, childcare, transportation, sustainability, so on and so forth, right? It's a long list. This is what makes headlines. These are the conversations around the dinner table in our communities. But we have to ask, beyond treating the symptoms, how do we address root causes? How do we alleviate these issues so that we're better off in the long term? So the root causes we identified were demographics and housing scarcity. So we built the plan on these two pillars of people and places. We're going to dive into some of the data on demographics, and then in the second half of the presentation, we'll shift to talking about housing. I want to start here with a chart on Vermont's population distribution by age in the year 2000. Now, for anyone who's keeping count, yes, that was 26 years ago. It pains me to say that, but that's just a fact. So what we can see from this data is that Vermont's working age population, that dark green, that's ages 25 to 49. In the year 2000, there were about 226,000 Vermonters in that age cohort. In that same year, we had about 77,500 in the 65 plus cohort. So we had a lot of working age Vermonters relative to the number of elderly and the number of children. Now, if we fast forward and take a look at more recent data, here's what the picture looks like. That 25 to 49 age cohort has decreased by about 30,000. Meanwhile, the 65 plus cohort has more than doubled, and there are fewer children in our state as well. What that means is that our workforce is shrinking. That's why we're hearing from employers how hard it is to find employees. That means our tax base is shrinking. And it also means that the number of people that are in the commercial health insurance pool is also shrinking. So that's creating economic pressures that we're feeling in very real ways. Those are the symptoms. We're going to go from demographics now to talking about the economic and labor market impacts. So one way that we can track this is through this ratio called the dependency ratio. It's simply a calculation that looks at how many working age Vermonters there are relative to the number of children and elderly. So it's taking that info from the last slide and looking at it in a different way. And as you can see, that dependency ratio has been going up and up. And if we break it down into the components, we see that's because of an aging population. Median age in Vermont is nearly 44 years old now. So if we take that demographic information and then overlay the labor market information, here's what we get. The blue bars on this chart represent the total population within a given age cohort. Those are labeled here on the left. Then on top of the blue bar is a green bar that shows the total labor force in that age cohort. So what I want you to recognize here is that most working age adults are participating in the labor force. The reason why our state's labor force participation rate has been going down over the years is because of retirements. People are leaving the workforce because they're ready to call it quits and transition into a different phase of their lives. And you can see it's a very unbalanced chart here. One way I like to think about data is I translate a lot of things into sports analogies. It's just how my brain works. Part of my background's in athletics. So when I look at this, I think of this as Team Vermont. Let's pretend we're a college sports team. And we have a lot of seniors who will be graduating from our workforce soon, retiring, and we need to do a better job recruiting the next class of freshmen or transfer sophomores from other states. Because that's how good college sports teams sustain team success over the long term. It's not by accident. There's intentionality to bring in that new class of talent, right? And to do this, to improve our workforce conditions, to close that gap, there are two sets of strategies we can pursue. There's efficiency strategies and there's expansion. What do I mean by that? Efficiency strategies ask, how can we do more with what we already have? How can we reduce barriers to labor force participation? But you can only grow the green to the extent that there's blue, right? So we also need expansion strategies. We have to increase that working age population as well. That last slide was a snapshot of where we are today. This chart shows where we're going to be going in the next decade if nothing changes. So this is a calculation between workforce supply and demand. How many people are coming into the workforce versus how many people are exiting. I already showed you the demographic data. What that translates to in terms of retirements per year is about 17,000 people leaving the workforce throughout the state of Vermont each year. Now, that number alone is one piece of information, but we have to compare that to how many people are entering the workforce. Across the entire state, we only have 5,300 12th grade students total. 5,300. We don't retain 100% of them either, right? And even if we did, it wouldn't balance out the 17,000. So we have to take a look at what other ways are there to add to our workforce. We import a lot of college students to the state who come from other places. A portion of them stay, and they live and work in Vermont. We could increase that retention rate too. But even if we retained 100% of our high school grads, our homegrown talent, and nearly 100% of our college graduates, we would still need a small level of inbound migration to balance this workforce equation in the long term. So that's why we both need efficiency and expansion. Now, I've been told that whenever I show up to parties, I have to bring something of value to the guests. I can't show up empty-handed, and I didn't have it in my budget to bring beer and wine for everyone, so I thought I'd bring some local data. This is Orleans County population distribution by age with a quick overview of some of those statistics that I covered at the state level. So this county has a higher median age than the state averages, higher dependency ratio. So some of those dynamics that I described on the state level are also happening acutely here as well. And then the next one is that labor force and population chart. Again, some local data, similar shape to the state of Vermont. 802,000. This is the number that folks have heard associated with the Vermont Futures Project. It is the ambitious target that we set in the Economic Action Plan. And it's one of the reasons why people call me crazy, but I can take it. So where did this number come from? It wasn't just because of our area code. That 13,500 annual gap in terms of our workforce supply and demand is how we calculated this long-term goal. Because if we're to close that workforce gap and make sure that our employers have enough workers, that our hospitals are well-staffed, that our schools stay open, we need to grow our working age population. And when we project out 10, 15 years, the numbers get in the 800,000 range, but 800,000 sounds really big and scary in a Vermont context. And 802 for some reason just is a little more familiar and comfortable with a lot of people I talk to. I'm not sure why. No, I know. The great thing is, if we hit this number, we can still operate under one area code, so it doesn't threaten that part of our identity either. There's also a little bit of subliminal messaging happening here on the slide, so the picture behind the text. Does anyone recognize what day that was in Vermont's history? It happened not too long ago. Yeah, the solar eclipse. So the Vermont Department of Tourism and Marketing estimates that we had over 150,000 visitors to the state of Vermont that day, which means for one day, we had over 800,000 people in the state of Vermont. And we didn't break, we're still here. It's possible. So going from that, we covered some demographic data on the people side of the framework. Let's shift to talking about the places side of the framework, specifically housing. One of the phrases that I say to translate this data into something a little more memorable is Vermont needs more people and more people need Vermont. Right? The first part of that, we covered why from a data-informed perspective, from an economic perspective, but more people need Vermont. What do I mean by that? Well, we saw at the start of the pandemic, there was an influx of people moving here from other states. There was demand for Vermont. And that demand continues to persist. Price is an indicator between the balance of supply and demand. So as prices have gone up, it's a signal from our housing market that people want to be here. They want to buy homes. They want to participate in our communities. Some of that demand is coming locally from Vermonters. Some of that demand is coming externally. But inherently, demand for Vermont is a good thing. We need to respond to it by building enough housing, enough supply to meet that demand. Otherwise, we're going to continue to face affordability pressures. But I was speaking with a professor at Middlebury College, my alma mater, and he grew up in rural Alabama. And he was saying to me that his hometown, they're dealing with a very different challenge right now. They can try to build more houses, they could try to invest in economic development and support their businesses, but people keep moving away. People don't want to be there. And that kicks off a vicious cycle that's really hard to come back from. So his takeaway, what he said to me was, people want to be in Vermont, we kind of just have to get out of our own way. And that has really stuck with me, right? Because as we take a look at the data on affordability, we've seen this divergence, this separation between median home sales prices and median household income. So people aren't just saying it's unaffordable, but the data show that. It shows that it's true. And again, we can start to bend this cost curve and start to level out prices or even bring home prices down a little bit or rent prices down if we can create more supply than there is demand. So why has this affordability challenge grown? Well, we haven't built enough new homes. This is a chart that shows the distribution of homes in Vermont by the year in which they were built. About a quarter of the homes in Vermont were built before 1940. We have some very old housing stock. And then we used to build at a relatively healthy rate into the 70s and 80s, but in recent decades, new housing construction has slowed significantly, to the point that less than 20% of Vermont's housing stock has been built in the past 20 years. Now, I highlight Act 250 was passed in 1970 there, so I'll use that as the starting point for the next slide. We're going to just simplify the math a little bit. Median household size in 1970 was 3.21. We had a much younger population. There were growing families with adults and children all under one roof. We see that on the left side here. And we were building homes. So we were building homes to meet the needs of those larger families. Now, fast forward to today, median household size is down to 2.18. There are still only 2 homes on this slide. There are still 6 people, but 2 of them have left Vermont. Those were the kids that grew up here, who maybe wanted to stay in their hometown, or even just in their home state in general. But as they grew up, they then had to compete in a scarce housing market or stay at home with mom and dad because we didn't build enough homes for them to be able to choose to stay in their community. It also leaves us with some large homes that are occupied by fewer people now. So we have empty bedrooms, and we can't tap into some of that capacity that we have in our communities unless we build new houses so that we can bring a bit of mobility back to the market. There are some Vermonters who might want to downsize. There are some who might want to stay in place. Again, choice is a good thing in a market. For those folks who might want to downsize, if they don't have an option to do that, then they can't free up their home for a young family to move in. So this is why there's housing demand even coming from our community itself, because the needs of our population have changed. If our median household size today was the same as it was in 1970, Vermont would have over 900,000 people. So one way that I've been diving into this at a more local level is with a research on what I call latent capacity. This is just a simple calculation between a town's historical peak population compared to its current population, right? Because across the state, when we add it all up, there has been growth. Vermont's population has gotten a little bit bigger, but there are some towns that have experienced the opposite. They've experienced depopulation. They have fewer people today than they had at one point in the past. So all the areas that are blue and green on this map, those are towns that have fewer people today. And when we just ask the question, what if we restored each of those towns back to their historical peak? How many more people would that add to the state? Doing that would add over 70,000 people to the state of Vermont. That's just rural revitalization. That's just getting back to what many of those towns used to have. So in that context, right, growth, to that 802 number, we get halfway there just through revitalization. And I've highlighted what that would mean for Orleans County. So we haven't been building enough homes, and we can track the pace at which we might build homes through housing permits. That's one of the indicators that we track at a state level. Permits, permit, permission, right? That's the root word there. This is how many houses we allow to be built. If we want to build more, we have to allow more to be built. It's not like we're breaking laws of physics to create a new home or a new apartment complex, but the data here show that we make it very hard to do that in Vermont compared to other states. The state of Vermont needs about 7,500 permits or more per year to hit some of our long-term housing needs goals. That was from a study from the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, their Department on Housing, assessing over the next 5 years what Vermont needs, not just to hit some of these long-term growth goals for population, but just to replace the homes that we lose from storms, to alleviate the homelessness challenges, to, again, adapt to the demographics. Because as our population has aged, as I mentioned earlier, people's needs for housing have changed too. The next slide here is Orleans County housing permits. So again, I wanted to bring some locally relevant data. And we can see that there are some peaks and some valleys, but on an annual basis, that number is just under 200, just to put things in context. So I'm honed in on that word permit, right, permission. One of the phrases I hear quite often as I travel around the state is people will say, housing is a human right. I hear it at the local level, I hear it at the state level. This rhetoric is also present at the national level too. If housing is a human right, then it should be right to build housing. And many of our processes and our rules start with no as the default answer. If a proposal gets put forth, there might be some deliberation on it, and the onus, the burden is on the developers to get to a yes answer, right? To produce the thing that we say is a human right and is a need. So if we want to make progress, one of the ways we can do that is just by shifting our mindsets to say, what if we start with yes as the answer and then shape it from there? That can speed up development timelines. Communities have come together to say, okay, what is the type of development we want to see, and then make it really easy for that to happen. The next couple of slides are probably going to be one of your main takeaways or the reason why I never get invited back, but let's just go for it. So one of these things is accused of attracting crime, lowering property value, and even changing the character of a neighborhood. And it's even illegal in many communities, and the other one is cannabis. Priorities, right? Yes, this is framing it negatively, but there are some towns where it's probably easier to open a dispensary than it is to build housing. I see some head nods. So let's frame it more positively. Let's try the next one. One of these things reduces stress and anxiety, helps people sleep at night, and it can even boost the economy. Again, the other one is cannabis. Legalize housing. So the economic action plan, I said it's towards affordability and abundance, and we'll get very specific with what I mean by that. Vermont is ranked 3rd in the country right now in terms of state tax collections per capita. We're the green. The blue represents the other New England states. I'm inherently a competitive person, but that's not a podium I want to be on. I don't think we should strive to be first, right? In fact, I'd like to see Vermont go in the other direction. So let's distill it down, let's boil it down to a decision-making framework for us as communities across the state to ask, where do we want to be? Where do we want to go? Right now, we're at the intersection of the blue and the green circles. We try to provide ample services. This is something that I actually love about Vermont, that we care about our neighbors, that we want to take care of each other and make sure that we have access to things like healthcare and education and just viable infrastructure. But to do all of those things while we have that shrinking working age population and low population density means we have a high cost of living. It's a big bill for for very few people to try to shoulder the burden for. So one of the ways that we can lower the cost of living is by cutting services and cutting programs. And those conversations are already happening all around the state, and it's making a lot of folks nervous and even angry. And that is the scarcity pathway that can lower costs in the short term. But it also can have some dire long-term consequences. If a community doesn't have access to healthcare, if it doesn't have a school, it becomes significantly harder to attract the next generation of people to that community. It's that example that the professor from Alabama was telling me about. The other pathway is an abundance pathway. It's to embrace the idea that people are actually the solution and not the problem. And we can accelerate the growth of housing, we can increase the working age population, and then on a per capita basis, each of us doesn't have to pay as much in taxes to maintain the things that we already have. We can make it more affordable for people who are already here. So this is the decision that we have in front of us. Now I want to share with you how are Vermonters writ large feeling about this. This is a question that I placed in the Vermonter poll, which is a public opinion survey conducted by the University of Vermont each year. Great thing about partnering with universities is they have really good research methodology and produce reliable data. So I asked this question, are you supportive of growing Vermont's population size to strengthen its workforce? I asked it in 2022, and I've been asking it each year since. The latest data that I have is from 2025, and what we've seen is an increase in the number of people that are saying, yes, I'm supportive. I recognize the need for us to grow our population, and the number of people saying no has decreased. Right, that's quite a big change for 3 years. And I'll have 2026 data in April or May of this year, so I'm excited to see where it goes. The next question is about housing. Are you supportive of creating new housing to increase the population in Vermont? What about in your town? What about in your neighborhood? Right, so I asked this question at 3 scales. And yeah, I see some smiles out there, and the word NIMBYism is one that people often will shout out when I show this data, because there's a little bit of uncertainty and opposition the closer to home it gets. That should not be the takeaway from this slide. The takeaway is that at every scale, at the Vermont scale, at the town scale, even at the neighborhood scale, there are more people that say yes than no. Even at the neighborhood level, over 50% of respondents said yes, I am supportive of new housing. We've seen the rates of no responses decline as well. So Vermonters are speaking up, they're picking a spot on that Venn diagram. They're saying they want both affordability and abundance, not just one or the other. So to wrap up, I'm gonna zoom out a bit, just to put some of the goals that I've talked about in a broader historic context. I mentioned 802,000, which can feel like a daunting, scary number based on where we are now. We're at about 647,000. But if we take a look at our history, we've been growing at a pretty steady rate until the last 2.5 decades. If Vermont had continued on its growth trajectory that we had up until the year 2000, if we just continued on that, today we'd be at about 720 to 740,000. But things have stagnated, things have flattened out. We haven't grown much. And because of that stagnation, now we're dealing with the growing pressures of our changing demographics. But we can change this. We can get back on track. We can get to 802 with a little bit of growth. And that might mean that we have to make some bold decisions. We might have to take some risks. And the way that we've approached economic development over the past 2.5 decades needs a rethink. It's okay to have ambitious growth goals and then even incentivize them. We can use the carrot instead of just penalizing what we don't want. There's this habit in Vermont of being really good at saying no to things, which I totally understand, but we have to also show up and say what we want to say yes to. We can't only say no. We can't just use the stick, we have to try the carrot too. Because if we take a look at the last 2 decades, that's what I would describe as economic stick season. That's NEK-TV, if anyone's wondering. So to get out of economic stick season, we might need to try the carrot. I'll leave you with this. You're probably wondering, why is there milk up on the screen? 2% for Vermont. So to get to that long-term goal of 802,000, it would only take 2% growth per year. That's it, 2%. 2% growth. What does that mean in a local context, right? We talked about the 802 number. Yes, that'd be about 150,000 people over 10 years. But 2% in a local context, if you live in a town of 1,000 people, that means how do you welcome 20 new residents next year? That's it, right? 20 new residents in a town of 1,000 people. That might require 7 or 8 homes based on median household size. It's doable. We have to be able to break down the long-term goals into the incremental steps that we need to take to get there. Because the longer we wait, the harder it gets. But if we move now and embrace this, 2% for Vermont, and we drink our milk, we'll be okay. So, with that, let's wrap it up and open it up to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm going to invite you to come down here because the light's better, people can see your face better. And I'm Rick Efford-Chase. I'm the Executive Director of Newport Downtown Development. That's the group that has been supporting the work of the Housing Committee with Dr. Malik and his team, several of whom are here tonight. If you're on the Housing Committee for NDD, would you please just stand or wave your hand or something so people can see where you are? John and Kate and Nick, Andrew's back here. That's a group of about 7 or 8 people who have met every 2 weeks for the better part of a year, just asking the question every time we meet, what could we be doing to try and begin to respond to the need for housing in our community? And so several of us had heard Kevin Chu speak, and we really thought that he framed these questions in such a creative and helpful way that it would be really great to bring it to the community. So I want to say, first of all, thank you, because Kevin made a drive to get here tonight to be with us. And when I've heard Kevin do this talk, which has now happened 3 or 4 times over the last year, I find it's at least as rich to have Q&A and to see what you all want to talk about. So Kevin's got a mic, and I will go to anybody in the room who wants to stand up and frame a question, and we'll take those questions one at a time. Please wait till I get to you.
Thank you for coming. I'm Adam Ortiz, Newport, Vermont. Do you have a list of contractors that have a template for the sewage, water, and electricity? Because we have more houses and the grid is barely keeping up right now. Order of operations, that needs to be addressed before we have more of a demand on the electric and water.
Yeah, thank you for that question. That was part of the motivation behind the latent capacity research. So I showed this map earlier. I was working with some folks at the Agency of Commerce and Community Development who were tasked with trying to figure out where do we have existing capacity in terms of water, wastewater, electrical infrastructure. So we started to dive into the census data to ask, where are there fewer people today than there used to be in the past? And those might be places where it's a good starting point to tap into existing infrastructure. But you're exactly right. New growth beyond historical peaks, sometimes that's going to take an investment in new infrastructure as well. So that is an investment that if you're going to make, right, commit to a growth trajectory, because that's how you also pay it back and long-term make things more affordable for a community. But I'm really happy that you're thinking about all the stuff below the ground that often gets ignored, because it's a major component of successful development.
Yeah, I thought it was a great presentation, and I just was wondering, could you shed some light from your data on why you think that trajectory was pretty impressive, that it was consistently growing, but then those 20 years you said that there was a decrease, and I'm wondering could you just enlighten me on that? I'm really curious.
Sure thing. A big part of it is housing and our approach to housing in the state. I mentioned 1970 is when Act 250 was passed, and I think sometimes Act 250 takes all the heat but it's just one factor that has made building new housing difficult. You layer on top of it a variety of other rules and regulations, both at the state and the local level. And when you put that all together, it's had this slowing effect, which I showed on one of the slides. Sorry for skipping around here, but we've seen this deceleration, right? So as we slowed down the growth of housing, then practically speaking, we also slowed down the growth of our population because there wasn't any physical capacity for new people to move into a community. Combine that with some of the business climate factors that have made it difficult for businesses to not only start but to grow and scale in Vermont. Those factors together are part of the stagnation story, but we can turn it around. We just launched a competitiveness dashboard on the Vermont Futures Project website. It shows across a variety of metrics, where does Vermont rank compared to other states around the country? It's also a starting point for asking which states are doing this really well that maybe we could borrow some ideas from.
You never know where you're going, right? Three questions related to things you brought up. One, I'll go to Sophie. I'm Bob Primo, Derby resident. Three questions related to slides you illustrated. One is, you showed the number of housing permits, but not the number of applications. So I wonder if that gap will be much over the years. The second thing is, and you alluded to this as well, I think I've heard a figure that roughly 20% of the cost of building a house in Vermont is permitting. And how much realistically can we cut that before we throw the baby out with the bathwater? And the third thing is simply the fact that you can't build a house cheaply enough to make it affordable. It appears when you look at the numbers. What are we right now leaving either choices about the housing or technologies on the table that could change that equation?
Yeah. So I'll tackle that last one first. In our economic action plan, we examine different ways that we could approach building housing to make it more affordable. There's growing momentum around the idea of off-site construction, whether it's prefab, manufactured housing. There are good examples that are being implemented in other states that, again, we could try in Vermont that will lower that price point. In terms of the permitting question, so yeah, the National Association of Realtors estimates about almost a quarter of the cost of building new housing is in the permitting and regulations. I mentioned the book Abundance earlier. They dove deep into two case studies. One of them was examining the cost of building one unit of affordable housing in California versus one unit in the state of Texas. Same square footage, same materials, and the comparison was mind-blowing. It cost almost 4 times as much to produce that one unit in California as it does in Texas. Now, to relate that to what you said about how much is too much, are we going to throw the baby out with the bathwater? I'm not saying that we overnight just adopt Texas rules and regulations. There's a big spectrum between California and Texas, but I would argue we're probably a little bit closer to the California side of that spectrum than we are to Texas. And along that continuum, there are various price points as well. And then you had asked 3 questions. I think I've touched on 2. What was the third one?
About the number of applications versus the number of permits.
Applications, yes, there are more applications than the amount of permits issued. But when a developer or when anyone applies to something and they repeatedly hear no, over time it decreases the number of applications too, if there's an anticipatory effect happening. Right? If you put in 10 applications and they all get denied, you might not put in the 11th one. So yes, there are more applications than permits, but that gap closes over time if the answer is no, no, no.
Thank you, Kevin. Nick McClure. I think, with the state, we've got to find some balance between protecting our natural resources and creating housing. And I'm curious to hear your perspective of where you feel we are in that balance or imbalance.
Yeah, great question. So I didn't mention in my intro, my background is actually in environmental studies. That was what I majored in college. So it's something that I think about quite often when we have development conversations, because I would venture to guess a lot of Vermonters are very proud of the environmental stewardship of our state. We love the green landscapes, we love the water, we love the clean air, and I actually have some bonus content, so I'll bring it up. This is one of the tensions that we have to grapple with, but we also can take a look at data to better understand where we are and where we might go. This is something that gets said to me a lot, that growth and development are a threat to Vermont's environment and beauty. And I think that we can dispel that myth with data. One of the ways I look at this is just through a historical lens. Vermont, we didn't used to look as green as we do today. Right? At one point, we were down to 20% forest cover in this state. There was widespread deforestation, a lot of that from sheep farming. So if you take a look at a picture from 100 years ago, it probably wasn't black and white, but it was various shades of brown. And Vermont is this incredible story of environmental stewardship and conservation that got us back up to nearly 80% forest cover today. And in that time that we went from 20% to 80%, our population has more than doubled. Right? So we were able to do two things at once. When we take a look at more recent history, just the past 20 years, we've seen our economy has grown a little bit, so that top line is GDP, gone up by about 58% in 20 years. Meanwhile, greenhouse gas emissions have gone down by about 47%. Again, economic growth and environmental sustainability can happen simultaneously. They're not always at odds. And one of the pieces of data that really stood out to me in an agency of transportation research study, they modeled out different growth scenarios. So they asked, okay, if we do grow, how we grow, what is that impact to the state of Vermont? So the scenario on the far right side is dispersed growth. What if we continued with, let's say, sprawl, right? What does that do? Well, more people means more emissions. But then the other scenarios they looked at, one of them was embracing the idea that a little bit of density actually might be a good thing in terms of lowering the cost of building, right? You get economies of scale. But you also reduce greenhouse gas emissions because it reduces the number of vehicle miles traveled. If you don't have to drive as far to get to the grocery store, to your doctor's appointment, or to work, then actually it's really beneficial for the environment too. So I hope that helps you to dispel this myth of environment versus the economy. That's one of the things I get most frustrated by, is we can actually do two things at once.
So I'm Jeffrey Wilson from Coventry. So I have two questions. I'm going to try to keep them relatively straight. I'm not the best at it on the spot, but since we've had 2 decades of more or less stagnant growth, our ability to actually build more housing has decreased because, as you say, with no's comes less interest in trying to do it. Yeah. Since we have lost the ability to build housing at the rates that we need to, have you looked into data supporting actual state-built and ran housing, where the state actually takes the resources directly, has a building company of some sort and builds the housing, or going through and actually doing development plans that it could then sell to private ones. So it's all the permits, everything's already figured out up front. This is where we need something built. Who's able and willing to do it?
Yeah, thank you for those questions. On the first one, I haven't looked specifically at state-built models, but most examples I look at show some sort of public-private partnership. I mentioned in that goofy slide with Noah Khan's face that maybe we should try carrots as well. This is one way that the public sector can play a role, is what are you incentivizing, right? That's one lever that the public sector can use in order to help get new housing built. There's the workforce piece of this too, as you mentioned, with the no responses and the stagnation. One of the practical limitations that we run into is who's going to build the homes, especially given our aging workforce. There are a lot of folks who are leaving the trades who are exactly the ones that we would need to help with this. There just aren't enough of them and not enough new folks coming into that sector. So we're stuck with this like chicken or the egg scenario. We need more housing and we need more people, but we can't get more people unless we have new housing. This is where it's going to take a bit of creativity and innovation. And I was really inspired by a conversation I had recently with the leadership team at Vermont State University. So they have a network of campuses across the state. And what they shared with me is that their campuses right now are about 30% overbuilt, meaning if their enrollment went up by 30%, they would still have space for more students. But then we start to just ask, well, what do we do with that space in the meantime? And one idea that we discussed was, well, maybe there's a model where we can help bring in some temporary workforce to get us unstuck from this chicken or the egg. And it's a model that works in other industries. We have travel nurses in healthcare to help meet surge demand. We have seasonal workers in agriculture. We have seasonal workers in our tourism and hospitality industry. Why don't we try a similar model with construction and the trades as well? Especially because that 30% overbuilt, that's an annual average, but we all know that construction season isn't necessarily year-round in Vermont. The prime time is the summer, and that's when a lot of students are gone and at home, so there's actually even more space. So that's one of the ways that we can address those limitations. Does that answer your question?
Right behind you.
Kelly Shanahan, Newport Center. Thank you for coming. This is really all great information. We just moved here in 23 and we love it. And I'm always working on all the young people I know.
Welcome. Thank you.
Up here, including our own kids. Anyway, I had a question about multi-unit dwellings because I don't really see very many of them around. There's some going up in Newport Center right now. But that would be a way for smart growth and maybe reaching economies of scale or to minimize the cost of new housing. Is that being thought about or addressed?
It is, yeah. A lot of towns are taking a look at some of the zoning and regulations that they have in place that in the past may have made it harder to build multi-unit housing. And when we take a look at Vermont's data on multi-unit versus single-family homes or different housing types, Vermont skews very heavily towards single-family homes and generally on larger lots as well. There was a study by, I think it was Zillow, that found of active listings, Vermont had the largest average lot size of any state in the country. So, to your point, perhaps we should try something a little bit different.
With that changing demographic of the aging population, we're not so able to care for properties or homes.
Yeah, so the comment was about an aging population and the practicality of maintaining a larger home and a larger lot. That's why I mentioned earlier that there are some folks who might want to downsize. They may want to be closer to the center of town with amenities nearby and a walkable place, and that they're sick of plowing their driveway and mowing the lawn in the summer. Some people want to stay in that type of property. Again, choice in a housing market's a good thing. But we have to create those options to make it viable. And then it opens up those larger homes for young growing families as well. So that's hopefully one of the takeaways is that creating new housing, yes, there's the direct benefit of who moves into that housing, but there's also secondary benefits for the housing that gets opened up when those people move. And I don't think that gets talked about enough in housing conversations. But given our demographics and some of the data that I showed on latent capacity, I'm actually hopeful that we can create a significant amount of positive change with just a little bit of action.
Hey, Scott Grimes, live over in Newport Center. I'm a really lazy person, and when I, facing the barrel of a complex problem, instead of kind of struggling through it myself, I like to find somebody who's done it before and I kind of stand on their shoulders. Do you have an example of successful projects that like revitalized a particular area, or a particular town, ideally in Vermont or in some other states that we can maybe emulate after?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I actually don't think that is like even a lazy person's question. I think that's a very astute question. And I think sometimes laziness is a way to just hide innovation. So I'm going to turn it around and say kudos to you for that. One example near where I grew up. So I grew up in Burlington, and the town next to Burlington is Winooski. And they had experienced a bit of decline because it was a mill town, and when industry left, they were trying to wrestle with, okay, what is our future? What do we want to do? What do we want to be? And they had some existing underutilized infrastructure. And then they created a TIF district, so they pursued that as an economic development tool. At the same time, they also implemented in a portion of their downtown what's called form-based code. It's a different approach to zoning to just say, okay, what is the type of development we want to see? The community came together and they went through a few iterations of design parameters. So it was really focused on the aesthetic. They wanted to preserve that look and feel of Winooski. So they came up with a few different models essentially for if a developer proposed a development that fit within those community-defined parameters, they were going to fast-track it and say yes. And I realized this was the other part of your question that I didn't answer. At the state level, there's some momentum in this direction. The Department of Housing and Community Development released what they call their Housing for All Toolkit. And now they're training people to be small-scale developers in communities all around the state. And within that toolkit, they have about 10 different design models that are meant to be those pre-approved types of housing. And if a small-scale developer chooses one of those, then it removes some of that uncertainty. They don't have to wait 3 or 5 years to get to a yes answer. They don't have to carry the holding costs of those projects and sort of speculate hundreds of thousands of dollars waiting to see if their project can even move forward. So those are a couple of examples, one of a specific town, but also another at the state level for how these things are starting to move in a direction of defaulting to yes.
Thank you, Richard Nelson. Act 181 gave us relief for burdensome regulations in Tier 1A and 1B when we get through it all. Tier 2, a little different, the road rule, not real in love with it. And Tier 3, I think, has issues that we'll discuss in Montpelier. But in Tier 1A, 1B, if they could remove more of the penalties for housing. And the one I'll bring up, and I'm a dairy farmer and own a lot of prime ag land, but when you have a section of land maybe up on a hill that should be in Tier B for housing, it has great soils for septic, those penalties for removing it from prime ag need to be taken away and need to be corrected. Remove the burdensome regulations.
Yeah. I'm with you on that.
Lori Grimm, resident of Newport. In any of your studies, have you put any information in on some of the things that have been happening in the last 5 years with out-of-state buyers for rental properties, either long-term, short-term, Airbnb, VRBO, any of those types of things? How does that figure in with all of that?
Yeah, I've been digging into some of this data because it's a question that comes up a lot. On a state level, the amount of properties that are used for short-term rental are actually quite small in terms of the overall housing stock. It's in the 1% to 2% range, but there's a high degree of variability on a town-by-town basis, right? Some towns are dealing with 30, 40% of their housing stock in that market. And that regional variability isn't too big of a surprise, right? If you live in a resort town, it's a different demand from the visitor economy than it would be elsewhere. So that, when I take a look at that level of variability, feels like a local issue. And then the question about investors buying properties, this is a conversation that's happening at the national level. Should corporations be allowed to buy homes speculatively? And is that a major factor in driving the cost of housing? And again, there's a lot of regional variability. That activity isn't really happening in Vermont. Our affordability challenges are coming from the lack of building new housing supply over many decades, and not from some of these other pressures that are present in other parts of the country or on a town-by-town basis. But it's not the driver of our challenges here in Vermont. I also want to share one other thought on that, which is, has anyone heard of the app Turo? Yeah, I see a few hands. So how do I describe Turo? It's like the Airbnb of car rentals, right? So when you think car rental, there are the major companies like Enterprise and Hertz, but Turo is this app that allows an individual to put an extra vehicle that they own on the rental market. And if you travel, let's say you fly to a city somewhere else, instead of renting from Enterprise, you can just rent someone else's car. It's often cheaper too. And I was just thinking about that. I'm like, I've never heard anyone get mad at someone for owning a second vehicle. Why is that? Right? And there's a lot of, let's say, animosity sometimes towards owning a second home. And that's what brought me back to this abundance versus scarcity framework. We have abundance in the automobile market. Some people might argue an overabundance, but we have scarcity in the housing market. And if we were able to achieve a level of abundance in the housing market, then I think it would alleviate some of these dynamics that we see when it comes to short-term rentals or Airbnb, because there are places around the country where people tried to invest in Airbnb and actually have stepped away from that market because there was more supply than demand, and they're like, oh, people are just staying in hotels anyways. Yeah, that's my little side story. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Kitty Upper Chase, and I live in Newport. I just wanted people to know that one piece of all of this has to do with high-speed internet. And I work with NEK Broadband, and I just want you to know that the state of Vermont has been putting money in, and we've been getting federal money to address that issue. We have developed public infrastructure organizations called Community Union Districts, CUDs. There are 9 of them around the state. The one that's here in the NEK includes NEK and 20 towns around Montpelier. It's called NEK-TV, so Northeast Kingdom, Central Vermont. But what I want you to know is that it is nonprofit and that it is run by a governing board with representatives from every town in the district. And the mission is to get high-speed fiber internet that's going to last for decades to everybody that doesn't have it. So it's not high-speed internet that's going to St. Johnsbury or to Newport City. It's going up all the dirt roads. And I think that it's an important piece of how we get to more housing and how we get to flexibility and people being able to live where they want to live and also be able to make a living. And in my dreams, it's also part of lowering greenhouse gas emissions so that people can do things from their home and they don't have to drive for a long time in cold. So I just want you all to know that that's going on right now all over the state. And here especially, we have a really strong organization that has built over 1,000 miles of fiber. And you can go to NEKbroadband.org and put in your address and see if you're covered or what the timing is. Or you can talk to me afterwards, or I live in Newport and I'm around. But I just wanted you to know that that's a piece of it. And my question I have is around the cost of construction, around the actual materials, the construction materials. And somehow I feel with the tariffs that have been happening, that it's just like the thing that's put it over just makes it impossible. And I'm wondering if you've done any research or any thoughts about how that piece fits into it.
In our economic action plan, we break apart what can feel like an overwhelming proposition of building new housing. We break it into component pieces using what I call the 5 L's framework. Land, labor, lumber, that's the materials, lending, and laws. I'll say that one more time. Land, labor, lumber, lending, and laws. So within each of those, we then ask the question, what do we have control over as a state, or what can we influence? And what do we need to just set aside? Federal interest rates is a big factor in housing. We don't set those here in Vermont. Every state is dealing with that as a challenge. And yes, it's a big one. Let's set that aside. Cost of materials. A lot of that's dictated by supply chains, what's happening regionally, nationally, internationally. That's something that, again, is a challenge. Maybe there's a small piece of it that we can impact. I'm hearing some discussions about perhaps sales tax exemptions for building materials. That would be a place where Vermont could have some influence. Across each of those 5 L's, we have to keep applying that thinking. What can we influence? What can we impact? Even if it's just 1% or 2% of the overall cost on a $300,000, $400,000 home, 1% is a sizable chunk. And if we add up multiple things, we can start to drive down the cost to make it at least reasonable or viable. So projects can pencil out. This is just one of the ways that I try to approach my life, which is let's not worry so much about the things we can't affect and focus our time, energy, resources, and attention on the things that we can.
We're going to take a few more questions. I have a firm commitment we'll be done at 7:30, okay, just so you all know.
Hi, my name is Leanne Harkle, and I have a question that's kind of tangentially related to the actual building of housing, but very much related. And I was wondering, has the Vermont Future Project collected any data regarding the average, furthest distance that new young families are willing to be away from elementary schools in those small towns that might choose to close their schools, or do you have 20 to 30 year growth projections for those small towns after they've closed their elementary schools? Because what I'm really wondering is, are they going to still continue to grow as long as we have that affordable housing, and are they going to grow with families with young children? I know that's kind of a complicated question, but it's very much related to the housing.
Yes, it is. Thank you for that question. When I examined the data for who has been moving to Vermont over the past few years, I was really surprised in a good way that most of the people who moved here were between the ages of 25 and 44. It's that age range for young families with children, right? This is why I'm scared of the scarcity pathway, because if access to education is harder to come by in a given community, then again, it's harder to attract those young families. One bit of data that I didn't include in this slide tonight, or in the slide deck, I mentioned latent capacity by town, and I'll go back to that, but I did a parallel study where I mapped out latent capacity of enrollment in our existing schools. Over the past 20 years, our public school system has gone from about 100,000 total children to about 80,000 today, which means there are some school buildings with far fewer kids in the classroom on average than what they had just 10 or 20 years ago. So that map of late enrollment capacity gives us an idea for, okay, what are communities that are ready and have capacity for young families to move in and still have space in the classroom? Without growth, then the viability of some of the small schools becomes harder and harder, right? Because that trend of fewer students in our school system, that trend is projected to continue over the next few years unless we start to grow. And again, I'm worried about crossing that scarcity threshold. And if we want to avoid that, then the abundance pathway is the path forward.
Hi, Charles Kahn, a resident of Coventry. So 2 quick questions. The first one is, in this discussion around housing, is all housing good, from multifamily development, single homes, $1 million luxury homes, because of what you said about opening up the market at multiple price points people can move around? And the second question is, assuming we are able to build these houses and they cost what they cost and people move in, can families afford to pay the mortgage and live in that house given the salaries that are available in Vermont? And is the economy ready to absorb that, or does that also need to grow?
Yeah, and thank you for that question. So I did paint some broad brushstrokes in terms of more supply in a housing market is a good thing, right? But you're asking a great question about like what types of housing at what price points, and I think that is exactly where you were leading us, which is we have to take a look at the local demand or labor market and the wage structures in terms of building the types of housing within the range of what a community needs. You'd mentioned wages, and that's actually something that gets touched on quite a bit in Q&A, so I prepped some content on that. And I'll get to it in a second. Here we go. So this is one of the things that I hear quite often. We can't attract and retain people because wages in Vermont are not competitive enough. I mentioned I grew up in Vermont, and this was a story I was told over and over, and people would say to me, Kevin, if you move to a place like Boston or New York City, you'll earn higher wages, right? So I kind of internalized that message. But I was like, wait, there's data. We can actually take a look at this. How are we doing? And this story that actually used to be true, Vermont was not as competitive, is starting to fade a bit. So Vermont was ranked 20th in the country in 2024 in terms of median household income. And over the last 5 years, we've actually had the 3rd fastest rate of growth in median household income. But that's only half the story, because median wages, that's one side of the affordability equation. Affordability is a 2-sided equation, and cost of living is where Vermont falls short, right? So housing is the primary driver in this cost of living side of the equation. We rank 43rd here, so we're in the bottom 10, one of the least affordable states. So a dollar earned and spent in Vermont won't go as far as it will in another state. And given that housing is a significant contributor to this, if we, again, can create a new housing supply, and yes, sensitive to the price points that are needed in a community, then we can start to make the wages that you're earning now go even farther than they do. So, affordability, 2-sided equation. We're actually making progress on wages. We need to make a lot more progress on cost of living.
The question back here, Kim.
Hi, Susie Small, Newport. Have you presented this to the State House in Montpelier? And if so, what is the feedback and what are the biggest roadblocks that you're hearing from our elected officials?
I've presented a few times to a few committees over the past couple of years. I think there's growing awareness of the work, right? That's the first stage, is just an awareness of the data. I'm starting to see some movement this year in terms of bills put forth that actually prioritize economic development and try to reduce the barriers to housing growth. I think one of the things that I hear most often from folks I speak with at the State House is they want to hear from you. They want to have the backing of their constituents to take some of this bold action, these brave steps. It's part of why I presented the Vermonter poll data, because when I take a look at this, again, there are more people saying yes than no, but this is when you receive a request to participate in a poll. This is different than showing up in a public forum and speaking up and making your voice heard to say, yes, I support housing, yes, I support growth. So I think that our leaders in the State House want to hear from you so that they know there are people ready to stand by what the data reflect. Otherwise, a lot of the voices they're hearing are actually perhaps a vocal minority that are saying no.
Question here, Kevin. Thanks for the presentation. My name is Brian Langer. I'm in Newport Center. I'm curious if you've created or collected any data or looked at what folks would, like how climate refugees are going to influence Vermont population. I know there's been some movement just for COVID specifically, but what are we looking at longer term?
Yeah, great question. It's part of why I'm saying more people need Vermont. Part of why I anticipate that the demand for Vermont not only will continue as is, but may even increase. My younger brother moved to Colorado in 2020, and the first time I visited him, he was living in Denver at the time. I flew in and there was an active wildfire in Boulder. And that was just a crazy scene, like nothing I'd ever seen before. We saw the LA wildfires not too long ago. There's chronic drought in the American Southwest. When I take a look at data on climate vulnerability mapped across the country, the Northeast as a region is relatively favorable compared to other parts of the country. Now, I'm not saying there will not be impacts from climate change here in Vermont. We've already seen some of them with recent flooding. What I'm saying is on a relative basis, there are places that will be impacted more, and some of those people may need Vermont. So now we have a choice. Do we proactively anticipate that and plan for it? Because that could be part of our demographic solution too. If we know there are people that might need to move and might want to move before disaster strikes, maybe we lean into this idea that more people need Vermont and that we start to create that capacity. Because if we don't, one of the dynamics that could play out is that there is essentially a replacement dynamic where wealth wins out. And in the movement of people due to climate, it's important to differentiate between climate migrants and climate refugees. In climate migration, there's an element of choice, and there are a lot of people that have actually already moved that have the means and the wealth and the privilege to pick a spot on a map and go there. And that could push local residents out if we don't build enough new housing to anticipate that demand.
Kevin Doug Spates, thank you for your presentation. You indicated that, I think it was the Housing and Community Affairs has some models out there already. Just a thought, it costs between $25,000 and $50,000 to do just the engineering for Act 250. That's it, the architectural engineering. If there was a model out there that a developer could take that model and put it into Martin, Newport, Middlebury, no matter where it was in the state, but it was accepted by the Act 250, that would cut a tremendous amount of cost down for developers, and it might take somebody, many contractors who would jump on that to go ahead and start it. Just a thought, if there's something close to that already.
I think aspirationally, they're trying to move in that direction. I'll pass on that direct feedback about the Act 250 engineering piece. But I think that a lot of their models right now are in anticipation of how the Act 181 maps might play out, Tier 1A, 1B, Tier 2, Tier 3. But I love the idea of going even farther and thinking, okay, what can we sort of put forth that can bypass some of the most costly steps in bringing new housing to the market? Thanks for that.
I'll just add to that the Commissioner for Economic Development for the state of Vermont, Lyle Jepson, is a Newporter. He grew up here, graduated from this high school, taught here for a couple of years, and he was back early in January for a town meeting in Newport. And one of the things he lifted up was the fact that that department, the Department of Economic Development, has been working on trying to develop something similar to what you're describing, Doug. That one of the things they're hoping for this year, Kevin referred to the program overall earlier, but one product they're actually trying to create is a catalog of 10 designs that can be used as ADU, accessory dwelling units, or infill housing on lots that are large enough to have a second home. And if their goal is that by the end of this year, there will be these designs where if you choose one of those 10 designs, it's automatically approved, and you don't have to go through any of the state level or much of the local level either to get those things to move forward. So they're thinking in a very similar direction.
If they could do something along a 4-unit or 6-plex or 8-plex.
Some of those designs are there.
Yeah, there's some of that too. Yeah. So listen, I'm going to call the questions to a halt here, but I wonder, Kevin, if you could put my favorite, the Venn diagram back up here for a minute.
Can I add one more fun fact and then go to the Venn diagram? So one of the things I hear a lot is, oh my God, this level of growth that we're talking about, aren't we just going to turn Vermont into New Jersey? No, seriously, I hear that a lot. And I, just a sec. This sentiment has translated not only into comments towards me, but this is a long-standing sentiment that shows up in a lot of odd places. I was stopped at a stoplight and I saw this bumper sticker in front of me, so I took a picture. And then I Googled this to find out that not only are there bumper stickers, there are lawn signs, there's a Facebook page, and it's a very common comment on social media platforms as well. So what I do, I'm a little bit of a nerd, so I ran the numbers, and Vermont's current population density is about 70 people per square mile. New Jersey's 1,300 people per square mile. That's a huge range, right? So for Vermont to become New Jersey, our population would have to grow to 11.5 million. I think we're gonna be okay. If we grew to 802, we'd go from 70 to 87 people per square mile. Do you know how big a square mile is? It's huge, 640 acres, thank you. 17 people in 640 acres. I trust our planners to be able to figure out that math. I think we have space. So I'll go back to that Venn diagram and just say thank you.
Yeah, so actually first, a round of applause please for Kevin. Now you can see why the Housing Committee thought that it was worth trying to get you all to come out on a cold February night to hear this guy. I think it's really, really helpful. And I just want to say, this slide has captivated our Housing Committee. We've spent, and I am not exaggerating, several hours just looking at this slide together and trying to figure out what it means to us and how we help people to understand the kind of the things that have to happen, the trade-offs that have to happen in order for us to respond to the challenges. And what I love about it is, it doesn't tell you there's only one path forward. There's actually more than one way we can go here, and that's a community conversation that we need to have around what we value in this community. So I wanted to leave you with that, kind of as your last image. If you picked up one of those paper copies of the survey tonight that the Housing Committee put together, please take, it'll take you less than 5 minutes before you leave. Fill it out and hand it back to me or somebody from our Housing Committee. Or pick up do we have the QR code on this? We probably don't. There on the door, there's a QR code as you go out. You can turn around and just capture the QR code and do it on your phone if you prefer. That's just fine with us. And that'll submit immediately. So please take a moment to try and give us some feedback. And I just want to say a few words about that feedback. There are in this room tonight a number of people from select boards across the NEK. And there are a number of you who came who are representatives to the state government from our towns. And I'm so grateful for you coming out. And I'm even more grateful for the fact that I've now had the opportunity to meet both together with all of our state representatives from the northern part of the NEK and also with all of you individually. And I can assure all of you in this room that we have a delegation to the State House who understands this problem and they want to do something. And I think what Kevin said earlier about backing them up and letting them know we got their backs as they're trying to make these cases, because they're saying it, I've heard them say it at the state level repeatedly, we have to do something about this housing challenge. And I think there are select boards that are really trying to ask these questions as well. So if you are a resident in any of the surrounding towns and villages here, please let your select board know that you're interested, not just that you have an opinion, but you're actually interested in trying to show up and make a difference. About half the people in the room tonight do not come from Newport. And I want all of you to know that while we're called Newport Downtown Development, our primary focus is trying to create the downtown that has kind of grounded all of our villages for many generations. Right? All of us have stories to tell about coming into downtown Newport on a Friday or Saturday night to do your shopping and go have dinner somewhere, or go dancing in Newport. And when we talk about trying to recreate that kind of vitality in our downtown, that's what it's about. We're trying to build this downtown so that it grounds all of us and makes us one community. So please, if you have interest in being a part of that effort, reach out and let one of us know. There are several board members we have. Please raise your hands. Eleanor's over there, and Dave is here, Andrea's here, Scott Grimes back there. Let somebody know that you want to be a part of it, and we will find a place to plug you in. Because we are not going to take on these challenges if we don't all step up and work on it together. And then finally, last thing I want to say tonight is I'd like you to give it up for Haley, a junior here at North Country who came to do our tech for us tonight on a cold night. Thank you very much, Haley. Thank you to Pam Lads, who shows up over and over and over again for our community as an act of community service and films these events for NEK-TV. And finally, one last thank you to the Housing Committee that has been meeting like clockwork every 2 weeks at 7:30 in the morning on a Thursday morning, trying to sort through these challenges and figure out what are we going to do to actually get housing built in our communities. Thanks so much. Kevin told me he'd stick around for 20 minutes or a half hour tonight if necessary, so if you have more questions, you don't have to rush out the door. Do the survey, have a good night, and thanks so much for coming out.